June 24, 1948, West Berlin. A Soviet checkpoint guard lowers a striped barrier across the Autobahn near Helmstedt. Behind him, freight trains sit motionless on rusting tracks. The order came from Moscow the night before. No trucks, no trains, no barges will cross into the city. 2.5 million people wake up, cut off from the world. The blockade did not come from nowhere. Since 1945, Berlin had been split into 4 sectors: American, British, French, and Soviet, an island of divided control, sitting more than 100 miles inside Soviet-occupied East Germany. For 3 years the arrangement held, uneasy but functional. Then, in the spring of 1948, the Western powers moved to introduce a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, into their zones. Moscow saw this as a direct threat to its economic grip on the region. Joseph Stalin's government responded the only way it believed it could. It would starve the western half of the city into submission. By June 24, every road, rail line, and canal into West Berlin was sealed. Coal shipments stopped. Food shipments stopped. Electricity, much of which came from plants in the Soviet sector, was cut as well. City reserves held roughly 36 days of food and 45 days of coal. West Berlin's military governors understood the math immediately. Without outside help, the city would run dry before autumn. General Lucius Clay, the American military governor in Germany, considered sending an armed convoy down the Autobahn to force the blockade open. His advisors warned this risked direct war with Soviet forces stationed along the route. An alternative existed, one the Soviets had not blocked because they believed it was impossible: the air corridors. Under the 1945 agreements, 3 20-mile-wide air lanes connected West Germany to Berlin, and the Soviets had no legal way to close them without provoking a crisis of their own. On June 26, 2 days after the blockade began, the first American cargo plane, a C-47, lifted off from Rhine-Main Air Base, loaded with flour, milk, and medicine. It touched down at Tempelhof Airport 80 minutes later. It carried about 3.5 tons. City officials calculated West Berlin needed roughly 4,500 tons of supplies every single day just to survive. One aircraft, once, was nowhere close. What began as an improvised gesture would have to become something no Air Force had ever attempted, sustaining an entire city indefinitely from the sky. The operation was named Vittles by American crews, and, more grimly, the Air Bridge by Berliners. General William Tunner, who had run the demanding hump airlift over the Himalayas during the Second World War, was brought in that July to bring order to the chaos. He found aircraft stacking up over Tempelhof, pilots circling for hours, near collisions in fog. Tunner imposed strict rules: one approach only, no circling. If a pilot missed his landing, he flew back to base rather than try again. Aircraft would land, unload, and depart within 30 minutes. Under this new discipline, the airlift transformed. Ki-54 Skymasters replaced the smaller C-47s, each one able to carry 10 tons. Aircraft took off at Rhine-Main and Wiesbaden at intervals of 3 minutes, day and night, in every kind of German weather. By the autumn of 1948, planes were landing at Tempelhof roughly once every 90 seconds during peak hours. Ground crews of German laborers, many of them former Luftwaffe mechanics, unloaded each aircraft by hand within minutes of touchdown. Coal presented its own problem. It was heavy, it was dusty, and standard sacks tore easily in cargo holds not built for the job. Ground crews adapted, using surplus tarpaulins and repacking coal into smaller loads that could be moved fast. Engines strained under the added weight in the thin, humid air. Mechanics worked around the clock, keeping aircraft flightworthy, cannibalizing parts from damaged planes to keep others airborne. West Berliners lived under the drone of engines nearly every waking hour. Households received ration books, limiting them to around 1,990 calories a day, dropping lower during the hardest stretches. Electricity was available for only a few hours at a time, often overnight, forcing families to schedule cooking and laundry around blackout hours. Despite this, morale in the western sectors held. Berliners who had lived through the war's bombing raid now watched foreign aircraft overhead, not as a threat, but as a lifeline. One young pilot, First Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen, changed how many Berliners saw the operation entirely. In July 1948, while visiting children gathered at the fence near Tempelhof, he noticed they never asked him for chocolate or gum. the way children often did around American servicemen elsewhere in Europe. He promised to drop candy from his plane the next time he flew over, telling them to watch for him wiggling his wings. He kept his word, tying small parachutes made from handkerchiefs to chocolate bars and dropping them as he approached the runway. Word spread quickly among Berlin's children. Letters addressed simply to Uncle Wiggly Wings began arriving at the base. What started as one pilot's private gesture grew into an organized effort, later named Operation Little Vittles, with American candy companies donating supplies and children across the United States tying tiny parachutes to send overseas. By the time it ended, pilots had dropped roughly 23 tons of candy over the city. Through the winter of 1948 into 1949, the operation reached its most dangerous phase. Fog blanketed the airfields for days at a stretch. Ice built up on wings and propellers. Runways at Tempelhof, never designed for this volume of traffic, began to crack under the constant weight of landing aircraft. Construction crews, working alongside German laborers using hand tools and requisitioned rubble from bombed buildings, built an entirely new runway in under 3 months. A second airport, Tegel, was constructed from scratch in the French sector in just 90 days, using thousands of Berlin residents working around the clock. The Soviets, watching the airlift succeed where they expected it to fail, ramped up harassment without direct confrontation. Soviet fighter planes buzzed transport aircraft in the corridors. Searchlights probed cockpits at night. Anti-aircraft units conducted live fire drills uncomfortably close to the flight paths. Despite this pressure, no Soviet aircraft ever fired on an Allied transport, and no Allied pilot broke formation to retaliate. The tension stayed just below the threshold of war. By spring 1949, the airlift was delivering more supplies by air than had ever moved into the city by rail and road combined before the blockade began. On April 16th, in a single 24-hour period later, called the Easter Parade, crews flew 1,398 flights and delivered nearly 13,000 tons of cargo, proving beyond doubt that the air bridge could outlast any ground blockade Moscow chose to maintain. Stalin's government had by now lost the argument it started. The blockade had been meant to force the Western powers out of Berlin, or to force them into a humiliating retreat. Instead, it had turned West Berlin into a symbol of resistance and turned Allied pilots into the city's protectors. On May 12, 1949, after nearly 11 months, Soviet authorities reopened the road, railways, and canals into the city. Trucks crossed the checkpoints for the first time since the previous June. The airlift did not stop immediately. American and British planners, distrustful of how quickly Moscow might change course again, kept flights running for several more months to build a stockpile against any renewed blockade. The final flight of the operation landed on September 30, 1949. Over its full run, air crews had flown more than 278,000 flights and delivered upward of 2 million tons of supplies at a cost of 101 lives lost among American, British, and German personnel, most in crashes tied to the relentless pace and brutal weather. The Berlin Airlift reshaped the post-war world far beyond the city itself. It hardened the division between East and West, hastening the formal split of Germany into 2 separate states within a year of the blockade's end. It also cemented the fledgling NATO alliance, giving the Western powers proof that coordinated resupply on this scale was possible against Soviet pressure. West Berlin, an island deep inside hostile territory, became one of the most closely watched symbols of the Cold War for the next 4 decades. Gail Halvorsen returned to Berlin decades later, an old man greeted by grown children who still remembered a chocolate bar drifting down on a handkerchief parachute. Many of the runways his generation built under threat of collapse are gone now, torn up or converted. The airfields themselves closed. What remains, preserved at Tempelhof, are a handful of the aircraft, silent now, that once landed every 90 seconds through fog, ice, and a blockade meant to starve a city into surrender.